good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you're watching this. My name is Drew Clark. I'm editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Very happy to welcome you for this one-on-one video interview with John Godfrey. John is the Senior Vice President of Public Policy for Samsung Electronics America, and we're here to talk about 5G. John, tell us a little bit about Samsung's interest in 5G.
Sure, Drew. Samsung is one of the leaders in 5G. It's something I've actually been working on for almost 10 years with the company, and very excited to see the state that it's reached, at this point, moving into the mainstream. But Samsung is obviously a maker of phones. Everyone knows about our phones. We are also one of the leading manufacturers of network equipment, 4G in many markets around the world, and now 5G in many markets around the world, including the world's first commercial 5G network, which we supplied equipment for with Verizon here in the United States in 2018. And we are a semiconductor manufacturer, and we make 5G chips that are used in the aforementioned equipment. So this is something where Samsung's engineers were involved in the original research on 5G and in the standard setting, worldwide standards bodies on 5G. And many of those same engineers are now working on 6G. So maybe in 10 years or less, you and I can talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, John, we're recording this, of course, in early July 2021. Last October, Broadband Breakfast kicked off a six-part series called A No-Nonsense Guide to 5G that was sponsored, of course, by Samsung Electronics America. That series had 6 parts. The first was kind of a lay of the land. The second part, we talked about some of the national security and supply chain issues. We talked about the enterprise and how 5G was really making a difference in enterprise applications. We, of course, talked about issues involved in rights of way and issues involved in adoption and use of broadband. And probably the last topic was the most important: spectrum. Looking back now, I guess 8 months, 9 months since we kicked that off, John, what are some of the things that have changed the most in terms of 5G and the 5G deployment as of summer 2021?
It was a great series, and I would encourage anybody who's watching this to go back to the Broadband Breakfast website, and some of that material is still fully timely and relevant. But I think most of it is. But there are some important changes since then, and probably the most important is that the FCC has conducted and completed an auction of the C-band spectrum, which is very important mid-band spectrum below 6 gigahertz, large chunk of spectrum. It was the spectrum that raised the largest amount of money for the U.S. Treasury of any of the FCC's auctions in history, and carriers are now building out. And the first part of that spectrum will be available and go live in December of this year. So deployment is in high gear right now. And what it will mean is that from coast to coast, there will be a significant chunk of spectrum that has a large bandwidth, a large throughput, more carrying capacity than the low band spectrum that had previously been built out. It doesn't have as much capacity as the very, very high band spectrum, the millimeter wave spectrum that the FCC actually allocated and auctioned off first several years ago. But that spectrum, the signals don't propagate as far. So it's actually more for concentrated deployments in areas with high congestion, high population density, or enterprise deployments. The sweet spot is the mid-band. Other parts of the world have actually deployed that ahead of the United States, but the U.S. is getting into that game in a big way right now, and that's what's really going to make the difference here.
Well, two comments following up. One is just the notion of C-band auction to deployment in less than a year, less than 12 months is really astounding, and that does highlight how fast new developments in the C-band are moving. I also want to kind of hone in a little bit on this mid-band question, and I appreciate you kind of bringing this to the fore. Obviously, there's been other proceedings involving the 3.5 gigahertz, and just kind of for the general audience, just to make sure everyone understands, right? Obviously, megahertz and the notion of a low megahertz, a 101, 102, those are the FM bands, and then you get up to the 300s, 400s, 500s megahertz. Those are the bands used or formerly used by broadcast television. And then we get up to the 1 gigahertz or 1,000 megahertz, and we're starting to get to bands that our cell phones use. And the mid bands are kind of in this 2.5 to 10, 11, maybe not quite that high gigahertz. Those are what we call mid bands. And can you just comment a little bit more, John, on why the mid bands are so important relative to the lower bands and the higher bands? And what about 5G allows all of these bands to be utilized?
5G is an evolution of the wireless standards and takes advantage of advances in processing technology and advances in radio engineering as well, since 4G was deployed. But 5G does not violate the laws of physics. You know, there is only so much spectrum available, and once spectrum has been used for something and is occupied, other people can't come in and easily use it at the same place, the same time, because of interference. So the FCC, like their counterparts around the world, plays a really important role in designating different spectrum for different uses. The midband spectrum, the reason it's important right now is that there are big chunks available. So in the case of the C-band, that is 3.7 up to 4.2 gigahertz. The first 100 megahertz of that is becoming available in December. So the satellite operators who previously occupied that spectrum are moving out, and mobile operators are moving in. And 100 megahertz is a great big chunk of spectrum. You alluded to TV broadcast spectrum down in the sub 1 gigahertz range. A TV channel, a broadcast TV channel, is just a 6 megahertz channel. LTE, maybe, typically 10 megahertz channels, but we're going to have 100 megahertz available all at once. More megahertz means more capacity. So lower signals would propagate farther. They propagate better through walls and trees and obstructions and things. But it's just all been used, for decades. It's just not clear. It's not available. And the very, very high frequencies, the millimeter wave up at 28 gigahertz and 37 to 40 gigahertz that the US has allocated, there's even bigger channels up there. So even more throughput available. But the signals just don't propagate as far, and they don't penetrate barriers as well. So midband's the sweet spot. Another thing that's happened and changed since we talked in the series last fall is the number of handsets that support 5G has just ballooned. And in particular, Samsung is proud of having not only had 5G handsets for several years now in our flagship phones, but now our mid-range phones, which are even down to below $300 devices, support 5G as well in this mid-band spectrum. So it's democratized. And what we are hoping is that maybe by this time next year, you won't even need to think about whether your carrier has a 5G network and your phone supports 5G. It will be so mainstream, thanks to this mid-band deployment, that we'll be able to move into the next phase, which is, once they build it, they will come. Once we have built the 5G network and deployed the 5G devices, then we can move into the rapid innovation phase, where new apps that people haven't even thought of yet that take advantage of the capabilities of 5G are going to arise and come to the fore the same way a lot of new apps came to the fore when 4G was deployed that people didn't anticipate, things like ride sharing.
Now, the expert opinion that you and Robert Kubik and Derek Johnson at Samsung wrote, which we'll also link to from this interview, really goes into this number of handsets. I think you identified 468 different handsets, a number that I'm sure has grown since then, plus specific models at good price points. One question we were going to talk about, you kind of answered, which is, will or is everything already 5G? And I think the answer was not yet, but soon. Is that fair, John?
Yeah, that's right. It's not yet to the point where you don't have to think about it. For example, the carriers are just now deploying the mid-band spectrum. I think all of the national U.S. carriers have low-band spectrum that they've converted to 5G, or that they dynamically switch between 4G and 5G as needed, depending on the usage in the area. So you can get a 5G signal, but that low-band 5G, while it's an advance over 4G, because it doesn't have the big channels, the throughput isn't as big a jump over what existed before as we're going to see with the deployment of these bigger mid-band channels. Yeah. So I would say it'll be everywhere, not literally everywhere, but it will be widely available, and you won't have to think about it as much a year from now.
So this piece that I've referred to that you, Robert, and Derek wrote makes mention of 67 markets worldwide where there's deployments. How many of those 67 are in the United States, and how far behind on the deployment, not on the equipment, but on the deployment, is the U.S. versus the rest of the world?
Well, the way that particular study is counting, the U.S. is one market. So each market is a country. So the U.S. would be one of the, one of those markets, 67, 68, whatever you said. I'm sorry, I don't have the number in front of me. Whichever it was, the U.S. is one of them. And within the U.S., all three of the nationwide carriers have been deploying 5G. Some of the new entrant carriers and smaller and regional carriers are deploying 5G. They've bought devices from as well. The U.S., I mentioned, was the first market in the world to deploy a commercial 5G network, and that was Verizon's 28 gigahertz network up in the millimeter wave. And they deployed it in Sacramento, California first, and used it as a fixed wireless residential broadband solution. They still have that service, which they've expanded to other cities as well. But you're unlikely to see millimeter wave literally deployed coast to coast, because the signals don't propagate that far. So it's something you would concentrate in specific areas. The U.S. 3-4 years ago did not have cleared mid-band spectrum to deploy, and other markets around the world did. So Korea, Japan, China, a few other places in the Middle East carriers began deploying 5G networks in that mid-band before it happened in the U.S. But I would say the U.S. is catching up rapidly there. You do have the former Sprint 2.5 gigahertz network, which is now part of T-Mobile, which is coast to coast, and a lot of that is 5G. And then there's the C-band spectrum that carriers have purchased. There's also the CBRS spectrum, which is in between those two, at 3.5, which is lower power, and it has a really interesting licensing model that's kind of a much smaller license area. In some cases, you can use it almost like it's unlicensed with the permission of a database, or you can bid for a priority license that puts you above those people. That's working out now, and most of the deployments so far are 4G rather than 5G, but at least in Samsung's case, all of that is upgradable to 5G. And then below the CBRS is a chunk of spectrum that the FCC is going to be auctioning off this fall, 3450 to 3550, which is being cleared by, and in some cases shared with, incumbent defense users. And so there will be some places and times when that's not going to be available. but in general, it will be available for commercial use, and we'll see how successful that auction is. But that's another 100 megahertz that's coming. So the U.S. has really gotten its act together and brought a lot of mid-band spectrum to commercial use in recent years.
No, that's a great elaboration and sort of further explanation about how we have seen progress in the United States in this 2 or 3 year period. And of course, your piece here, your expert opinion piece, does really recap Samsung's history of leadership in this space with milestones in 2012, 2014, 2018, and the specific things done in that case. The piece also does mention the role of millimeter wave, and you did say this isn't likely to be the coast-to-coast solution. You referenced Sacramento. What can you say about 5G that Verizon did in Houston and that AT&T did in Tennessee and Ohio? Again, those were referred to in the piece.
Yeah, sure. The Tennessee and Ohio with AT&T is actually a CBRS rural deployment for fixed wireless. The Verizon 28 gigahertz deployment is part of their commercial 5G home service, which launched first in Sacramento and Houston. And it's a really interesting competitive alternative for residential broadband to some kind of wireline solution coming into your house. And they've expanded it to other cities as well. And it uses 5G technology, but on the basis of the end user in their home being, not moving around. But it's the same technology as if you were out moving around. It just beams a signal to you at your house. And I believe they advertise about 1 gigabit per second data rates for that service, which is quite competitive with wireline broadband. It's certainly more than I get at my house. Yeah. So the millimeter wave spectrum is definitely something where there's been innovation in the United States. The Verizon residential service is one example of that. It's also something that we see all the carriers who have millimeter wave licenses, and I think most of them do, maybe all of them do, using as a high density location infill in a place where there's a really high traffic density, a high population, maybe at a place like a football stadium or a campus or just a downtown area, to augment their network with millimeter wave, because there's so much carrying capacity in that spectrum. And then it could be a really interesting enterprise solution, both indoors to something like a factory or a warehouse, as well as outdoors, and used, farming could be on a campus facility where you want to have remote security cameras, or you want to use cameras in a manufacturing or logistics process for quality control, and you really need high resolution real-time video. And I'm throwing a lot of ideas out here, Drew, but also one of the benefits that 5G brings, which we talked about in the series, is low latency communications. So it's both a high amount of data and a very, very, very short delay in getting a signal back from the network. And that's critical for remotely piloted vehicles or autonomous vehicles or remote operations. Like if you send a robot into a burning building, you want to remotely operate it, you want very little lag. These are things that you might not deploy in a coast-to-coast network in millimeter wave, but you could definitely deploy in a factory or a warehouse or some kind of an enterprise setting. We think there will be a lot of demand for that.
Yeah, great point. Great point about all of those advances that have and are part of the 5G mix. We'd be remiss if we didn't at least raise as a perhaps concluding question with the opportunity for final thoughts. How has the debate over national security and the supply chain impacted this discussion? On the surface, the last 12 months, 18 months have just seen extraordinary change. I'm just wondering, as you look at this from the perspective of Samsung Electronics America, what are some of the way you look at this? In some ways, kind of like a Cold War, that the way it's talked about 5G. What are your observations on that, John?
I think what's really important to focus on is that 5G is critical national infrastructure. It's very important that it be deployed in a way that is trusted and secure. And I think the FCC and other parts of the government have been focused on that, both the previous administration and the current administration. And there's been legislation coming out of Congress focused on that as well. Uh, Samsung is a manufacturer that has a strong presence in the United States. We have over 20,000 employees here. We manufacture 5G chips and other chips in Austin, Texas, and we have other manufacturing in the U.S. as well. Our global headquarters is in South Korea, which is a defense treaty ally of the United States. The two countries really could not be more closely aligned from a national security point of view. So we feel totally confident in the trustworthiness of Samsung's supply chain to bring solutions that can be trusted by carriers and users. And then cybersecurity is something that has to be built into telecom networks. The 5G standards do offer some advances in cybersecurity beyond what was in 4G, some improved capabilities. But as some people have pointed out, 5G also potentially opens more new attack vectors, they call them, more new endpoints, simply because in 5G we anticipate a lot more machine endpoints, a lot more sensors or robots or machine-to-machine communications. That's something 5G is focused on. So that means more points that need to be secure. So it's really important to manage cybersecurity well. Does that mean that the government should step in on that? I don't think so. I think this is something industry is managing very well. There is a lot of public-private collaboration that happens. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, for example, in the Department of Commerce, develops a lot of information security and cybersecurity standards for government and other enterprise users. And they've prepared cybersecurity guidelines that everyone can use, and that is, I think, the right approach, because technology is fast evolving, and any kind of rigid technology mandate that the government adopts is going to get outdated pretty quickly. That's how I would look at that.
Well, you definitely brought our attention to another extremely topical conversation about cybersecurity and that role and the way that the technologies that we're using can help contribute to those solutions. John, is there any final thoughts you have about 5G that you'd like to share with us before we conclude?
Just my excitement about the state that we're in at 5G. You know, there's always an initial round of excitement when a new technology comes along, a major new technology comes along, and people share a lot of use cases and vision for how it's going to be used, and people throw around ideas like robotic surgery, which may or may not actually be a good use case for 5G. I think the jury may be out on that. I might prefer my surgeon to be close by. I don't know, but that remains to be seen. But the fact is, when 4G was deployed, people didn't anticipate all the revolutions that it was going to make, but what and new business innovation that was going to come along. Because that was deployed, because 4G infrastructure was deployed in the United States broadly before other parts of the world, that contributed a lot to the fact that many of those innovative new companies in the ride sharing space, the e-commerce space, the social media space, telepresence, video conferencing, a lot of that happened in the US because we had the infrastructure for it. I think the phase we're in now in 5G is that the entrepreneurs and innovators who are going to figure out how to take advantage of the capabilities of 5G, they're in their garages and their laboratories working on it right now. And we will see the actual explosion of innovation coming really starting next year. And I think that 5G will be, like you asked earlier, is 5G kind of everywhere now? pretty soon it will be kind of everywhere. And that's when the excitement actually begins, when instead of focusing on the infrastructure, we focus on what it enables.
The applications and the use. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for taking this time. And thank you to each of you for watching us. And we'll see you around next time. On behalf of John Godfrey at Samsung, I'm Drew Clark at Broadband Breakfast, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Drew.
Bye-bye.